You're standing in what looks like paradise. The year is somewhere around 1200, and you're in the heart of what we now call America. Massive cities stretch before you, their pyramids reaching toward the sky. Thousands of people move through bustling marketplaces. Children play in the streets, while farmers bring in crops from fields that seem to stretch forever. This isn't some fantasy, this was real. These were the great civilizations of medieval America, and they were about to face something so devastating, so completely overwhelming, that within just a few generations, these mighty cities would become ghost towns, their people scattered to the wind, their entire way of life erased so thoroughly that when European explorers arrived centuries later, they couldn't believe such places had ever existed. What happened? Well, imagine waking up one morning to find that the rain just stopped. Not for a day, not for a week, but for years, decades. Imagine watching your crops wither, your rivers dry up, your entire world turn to dust. This is the story of the medieval drought that changed America forever. A climate catastrophe so severe, it reshaped an entire continent and left mysteries we're only now beginning to understand. The center of Cahokia was dominated by a massive earthen pyramid, now called Monk's Mound. This thing was absolutely enormous. The base covered 14 acres, and it rose 100 feet into the air. That's 10 stories high, all built by hand, basket by basket of earth. On top sat the palace of the paramount chief, overlooking a grand plaza where thousands would gather for ceremonies. The whole city was laid out with mathematical precision, aligned with the stars and the seasons. These people weren't just randomly throwing up buildings, they were master urban planners. But Cahokia was just one jewel in a crown of incredible civilizations. Travel southwest to the land we now call the Four Corners region, where Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Utah meet. Here, the ancestral Puebloans, sometimes called the Anasazi, had created something that seems almost impossible. They built entire cities into the sides of cliffs. Massive apartment complexes carved from solid rock, connected by ladders and precarious paths along sheer canyon walls. The largest of these, in Chaco Canyon, had great houses containing hundreds of rooms, some 5 stories tall, all constructed with precisely cut stone blocks that fit together so perfectly you couldn't slide a knife blade between them. And here's something that'll blow your mind. These people in Chaco Canyon built perfectly straight roads, some 30 feet wide, extending for hundreds of miles across the desert. Why would you need highways in the year 1100? Well, they connected a network of communities across thousands of square miles. Goods, ideas, and people moved along these roads. Turquoise from distant mines, seashells from the Pacific Ocean, copper bells from Mexico, exotic feathers from tropical birds. All of these treasures flowed through Chaco Canyon. It was like the Amazon distribution center of the ancient Southwest, except instead of cardboard boxes, they were moving the most precious items in their world. Down in what's now Mexico and Central America, the Maya civilization was experiencing its own golden age during this medieval period. Now, when most people think of the Maya, they imagine ancient pyramid builders from thousands of years ago. But actually, cities like Chichen Itza and Mayapan were thriving right around the same time as medieval Europe. These Maya cities had ball courts where they played a game that was part sport, part religious ceremony. They had advanced mathematics. They invented the concept of zero independently from the old world. They tracked the movements of planets with such precision that their calendar was more accurate than the one Europeans were using at the time. The Maya had a writing system too, the only fully developed written language in pre-Columbian Americas. They wrote books, actual books, on paper made from tree bark. They recorded their history, their astronomical observations, their religious ceremonies. Imagine having a library in the year 1200 in America. Most Europeans couldn't even read at this time, but Maya scribes were composing complex texts about mathematics, astronomy, and history. Let's talk about daily life in these places, because it wasn't all monuments and ceremonies. In Cahokia, most people lived in small, rectangular houses made of wooden posts and woven walls covered with clay plaster. They'd wake up before dawn, and the women would start preparing breakfast, usually corn porridge, maybe flavored with beans or squash. The men might head out to the fields or to work on construction projects. The city was always building something: another mound, another palisade wall, another plaza. Children in Cahokia played with toys that archaeologists have found: little clay figurines, gaming pieces, miniature pots. They probably played games similar to ones Native American children still play today, like various forms of stickball or hoop and pole games. Teenagers might be apprenticed to craftspeople, learning to make beautiful pottery, to work copper into jewelry, or to knap stone tools. The social life was rich and complex. There were different social classes: elites who lived atop the mounds, skilled craftspeople, common farmers, and possibly even slaves captured in warfare. People decorated their bodies with tattoos and paint. They wore elaborate headdresses for ceremonies. Music filled the air during festivals: drums, flutes, rattles. Can you imagine the sound of thousands of voices singing in unison in the Grand Plaza? In the Southwest, life was different but equally sophisticated. The ancestral Puebloans were masters of agriculture in one of the most challenging environments on Earth. They developed strains of corn, beans, and squash that could survive in the high desert. They built elaborate irrigation systems, channels, and reservoirs to capture every precious drop of rain. They studied the patterns of rainfall so intensely that they could predict good years and bad years. Living in those cliff dwellings must have been something else. Imagine climbing up and down ladders every day just to get water or go to your fields. But it was worth it for the security those locations provided. The rooms were cozy, often with beautiful painted plaster walls. They had underground chambers called kivas, where religious ceremonies took place, where the men would gather to discuss important matters, where sacred knowledge was passed down through generations. These people were artists too. The pottery produced by the ancestral Puebloans is absolutely stunning. Black, geometric patterns on white backgrounds, designs so intricate they look like they were made by machines. They made jewelry from turquoise and shell, wove intricate baskets so tight they could hold water, and created beautiful textiles from cotton they grew in the desert. The Maya world was perhaps the most urban of all. Cities like Mayapan had dense populations living in stone houses along paved streets. There were neighborhoods for different crafts, one area for the potters, another for the stoneworkers, another for the scribes. The markets were incredible, filled with everything from basic foods to luxury items. Chocolate, yes, chocolate, was a Maya invention, though they drank it as a bitter, frothy beverage, often spiced with chili peppers. It was so valuable that cacao beans were used as currency. Maya nobles lived in elaborate palaces with multiple rooms arranged around courtyards. They had steam baths, basically saunas, which they used for both cleanliness and religious purification. They slept in hammocks, another American invention that would later spread around the world. Their diet was surprisingly varied, not just corn, beans, and squash, but also tomatoes, avocados, papayas, pineapples, and dozens of other fruits and vegetables that wouldn't reach Europe for centuries. But here's where things get really interesting and a bit mysterious. All of these civilizations, despite being separated by thousands of miles, despite having different languages and cultures, all started experiencing problems around the same time. The signs were subtle at first. Maybe the corn harvest was a little smaller one year. Maybe the summer rains came a few weeks late. People probably didn't worry too much, right? They'd had droughts before. Their grandparents told stories of tough times that people had survived. But this was different. This wasn't just a bad year or two. Starting around 1150 and intensifying through the 1200s, a massive shift in climate patterns began to affect the entire continent. We're talking about what scientists now call the medieval climate anomaly, though that boring name doesn't really capture the absolute catastrophe it represented for these civilizations. In the Southwest, tree ring data, yes, we can actually read the history of rainfall in the rings of ancient trees, shows that the drought conditions were the worst in over 1,000 years. We're not talking about a California-style drought where your lawn turns brown. We're talking about decades where rainfall was less than half of normal. Springs that had flowed for centuries dried up. Rivers became trickles, then dust. The soil, already fragile in the high desert, turned to powder and blew away in massive dust storms. Imagine you're a farmer in Chaco Canyon in the year 1130. Your family has been farming the same plot of land for 10 generations. You know every subtle sign of the weather, every trick to coax corn from the sandy soil, but now nothing works. The elaborate irrigation canals your ancestors built are useless when there's no water to channel. You try planting deeper. You try planting less densely to give each plant more water. You perform every ceremony you know to bring rain. But the skies remain stubbornly clear, a brilliant blue that once meant beauty, but now means death. The social stress must have been incredible. These societies were built on the assumption that if everyone did their part, if everyone participated in the ceremonies, if everyone followed the rules, then the rain would come and the crops would grow. When that stopped happening, people started asking dangerous questions. Were the leaders still legitimate? Had the gods abandoned them? Was someone breaking taboos and bringing punishment on everyone? In Cahokia, the problems were different but equally severe. The Mississippi Valley didn't dry up like the Southwest, but the weather became wildly unpredictable. Some years brought floods that washed away entire villages. Other years, drought struck at crucial times in the growing season. The careful balance that had allowed such a large population to thrive in one place started to break down. And here's something that'll make you think. Just as the climate was becoming unstable, there's evidence of increasing warfare. In Cahokia, they started building massive wooden palisades around the central city. These weren't decorative fences, they were serious fortifications, with bastions for archers and gates that could be barricaded. They were preparing for attack, or maybe trying to prevent one through a show of strength. In the Southwest, many of the cliff dwellings seem to have been built or expanded during this time of crisis. Why go to all the trouble of building homes in such inaccessible places? Well, if you're worried about raiders coming to steal your last stores of food, a home halfway up a cliff face starts to look pretty attractive. Some of these sites could only be reached by climbing up handholds carved into sheer rock faces. You could literally pull up the ladders and be completely safe from attack. The archaeological evidence from this period is haunting. In some sites, we find unburied bodies, signs of violence, burned buildings. In others, we find evidence of cannibalism. Not ritual cannibalism, but survival cannibalism, the kind that happens when people are truly desperate. I know that's disturbing to think about, but it shows just how complete the societal breakdown was in some places. But here's what's fascinating. Not everyone responded to the crisis in the same way. Some communities came together, shared resources, and found ways to adapt. Others fell apart into violence and chaos. Some groups decided to stay and fight it out, while others chose to migrate to new lands. The diversity of responses tells us something important about human nature. There's no single way people react to crisis. Let me tell you about one of the most dramatic responses to the drought, the Great Migrations. Imagine entire cities, thousands of people, packing up everything they could carry and walking away from homes their families had occupied for centuries. This wasn't a rushed evacuation either. In many cases, it seems to have been planned and orderly. At Chaco Canyon, people carefully sealed up the kivas, the sacred underground chambers, as if they hoped to return someday. They took their most valuable possessions but left behind tons of pottery and tools, probably too heavy to carry on a long journey. Where did they go? Well, that's one of the great mysteries. Many probably headed south to the Rio Grande Valley, where water was more reliable. Others went north into the mountains, where rainfall was higher. Some groups probably split up, with different families going different directions based on kinship ties or personal preferences. Within just a few generations, the descendants of the Chaco Canyon people had spread across the Southwest, carrying their architectural styles, their pottery techniques, and their stories with them. The migration wasn't just about finding water, though. It was about reimagining entire ways of life. The huge, centralized settlements like Chaco Canyon gave way to smaller, more dispersed communities. Instead of grand public architecture, people focused on building practical homes. Instead of elaborate road networks, they developed local trade systems. It was like watching a civilization hit the reset button, keeping what worked and abandoning what didn't. In Cahokia, the decline was more gradual, but no less complete. The population peaked around 1050 to 1200, then began a slow decline. By 1350, the city was essentially abandoned. But unlike Chaco, where people seem to have left in organized groups, Cahokia's population appears to have drifted away family by family, seeking opportunities elsewhere. Some went upriver, others downriver. Some joined existing Native American communities, others founded new ones. The fascinating thing is that when Europeans arrived in the Mississippi Valley centuries later, the Native Americans living there had only vague legends about the mound builders. The connection to Cahokia had been so thoroughly severed that it was as if the city had never existed. Can you imagine something like that happening today? It would be like New York City being abandoned, and 300 years later, people living in the area not really knowing who had built all those skyscrapers. Down in the Maya lands, the response to climate crisis was complicated by political upheaval. The drought stressed agricultural systems that were already pushed to their limits. Maya agriculture was incredibly intensive: raised fields and swamps, terraced hillsides, elaborate irrigation systems. When the rains became unreliable, these systems started to fail. But unlike in North America, where people could migrate to entirely new regions, the Maya were hemmed in by geography. To the north was increasingly dry scrubland. To the south were mountains controlled by other groups. To the east and west were oceans. So instead of wholesale migration, Maya society underwent a transformation. The great cities of the classical period were largely abandoned, but people didn't disappear, they dispersed into smaller communities. The elaborate hieroglyphic writing system fell out of use. The complex calendar systems were simplified or forgotten. Monumental architecture stopped being built. It was as if the civilization decided that maintaining such complexity simply wasn't worth it anymore. But here's something important to understand. This wasn't the collapse or disappearance of the Maya that you might have heard about. The Maya people never went anywhere. They're still there today, millions of them, speaking Maya languages, maintaining many of their traditional practices. What changed was the political and economic system, not the people themselves. It's like if the United States government collapsed, but Americans were still living in America. The nation might be gone, but the people would remain. Let's talk about what these changes meant for individual families, because that's where history becomes real. Imagine you're a young woman in Cahokia in the year 1250. Your grandmother tells you stories of when she was young, when the great plaza would fill with 10,000 people for the harvest ceremony, when traders would come from as far away as the Gulf Coast with shells and shark teeth. But now the plaza is half empty. Many of the mounds are no longer maintained. The paramount chief still performs the ceremonies, but people whisper that he's lost the mandate of heaven. Your parents are talking about leaving. Your mother's brother moved downriver last year and sent word that there's good farmland and plenty of game. But your father's family has been in Cahokia for generations. The bones of his ancestors are buried in the mounds. How can he leave them behind? The arguments go on night after night. Finally, one spring, your family packs their belongings onto rafts and floats away down the Mississippi, looking back once last at the Great Pyramid where the sun is rising, just as it has every day for centuries, over a city that's slowly dying. Or imagine you're a young man in a cliff dwelling in Mesa Verde in the year 1270. The drought has been going on your entire life. You've never known a time when water wasn't precious, when every drop wasn't carefully managed. Your grandfather talks about the old days, when the corn grew tall and the storage rooms were full. But that seems like a fairy tale. Reality is the constant gnawing hunger, the careful rationing of food, the prayers for rain that seem never to be answered. Then word comes that relatives who left for the Rio Grande Valley years ago are doing well. They found a place with a reliable river, good soil, and friendly neighbors. It's time to go. But leaving means abandoning not just buildings, but a whole way of life. The cliff dwelling isn't just where you live, it's who you are. Every handheld worn smooth by countless climbs, every room where generations of your family have slept, every view from the terraces where you've watched the seasons change, all of this must be left behind. The journey itself must have been incredible. Hundreds of miles on foot through some of the most challenging terrain in North America, carrying children and elderly relatives, bringing enough food and water for a journey that could take weeks or months, following ancient trails or making new ones, stopping at springs that might or might not have water, always wondering if you've made the right choice, if the new land will really be better, if you'll ever see home again. And what about the psychological impact? These weren't just physical journeys, but spiritual and cultural ones. Many of these societies believed their identity was tied to specific places, sacred mountains, rivers where the ancestors emerged from the underworld, rocks where the gods had walked. Leaving these behind wasn't just emotionally difficult, it was cosmologically traumatic. How do you maintain your identity as a people when you've left behind the very landscape that defines who you are? Some groups handled this by carrying their sacred places with them, in a sense. They brought soil from their homeland to establish new shrines. They maintained oral histories that kept the connection to the old places alive. They adapted their origin stories to include the migration itself as part of their sacred history. The journey became not a tragedy, but a transformation, not an ending, but a new beginning. The climate crisis also accelerated cultural exchange in fascinating ways. As people moved and mixed, technologies and ideas spread rapidly. Architectural styles that had been unique to one region suddenly appeared hundreds of miles away. Pottery techniques were shared and adapted. Agricultural knowledge crucial for survival in new environments was exchanged. Languages borrowed words from each other. Religious practices blended and evolved. Think about it. This was one of the great mixing events in human history, comparable to the migrations that followed the fall of the Roman Empire in Europe. Except, instead of being recorded by historians and chroniclers, this North American story was preserved in oral traditions, in archaeological remains, in the very DNA of modern Native American peoples, which shows the complex patterns of movement and intermarriage during this period. And here's something that might surprise you. In many ways, the societies that emerged from this crisis were more sustainable and resilient than the ones that preceded them. The Pueblo peoples, who descended from the ancestral Pueblanans, developed agricultural and water management techniques that allowed them to thrive in the arid Southwest for centuries. They learned the lesson of the Great Drought. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. Don't build cities bigger than the land can support. Always be ready to adapt. The descendants of Cahokia spread across the eastern woodlands, forming the tribal confederacies that Europeans would later encounter. Groups like the Osage, the Omaha, and others carried forward elements of Cahokian culture, but in new, more flexible forms. Instead of one great chief ruling from atop a pyramid, they developed more distributed forms of governance. Instead of massive public works projects, they focused on sustainable communities. Let's pause here for a moment, because I'm curious about what you think. If you were living through such a crisis, watching your entire world change, would you stay and try to maintain the old ways, or would you leave for somewhere new? What would it take to make you abandon everything you've ever known? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Now, one of the most remarkable things about this period is how differently it played out from similar crises in the Old World. When Rome fell, we call it the Dark Ages. When the Bronze Age civilizations collapsed, it took centuries for complex societies to re-emerge. But in America, the response to the medieval drought was not a dark age, but a transformation. New societies emerged, often quite quickly, that were better adapted to their environments. The Hopi people of Arizona, for example, developed from groups that left the Chaco Canyon area. But instead of trying to recreate Chaco's centralized system, they built independent villages on mesa tops, each with its own ceremonies and governance. They developed dry farming techniques that could produce corn with just 8 inches of rain per year. Think about that. 8 inches. That's less rainfall than Las Vegas gets. Yet they've been continuously farming the same fields for nearly 1,000 years. The oral traditions of the Hopi explicitly reference the migrations from the north, the search for the center place, the learning of how to live properly on the land. Their entire cultural identity is built around the idea of emergence and transformation, of leaving behind the mistakes of the past and finding the right way to live. The drought isn't seen as a disaster that happened to them, but as a crucial part of their story, a test that made them who they are. Similarly, the Pueblo peoples along the Rio Grande didn't just recreate the cliff dwellings they'd left behind. They innovated. They built new types of multi-story apartment buildings, the Pueblos, that give them their name, which were more efficient and comfortable than the old cliff dwellings. They developed new ceramic traditions, new religious ceremonies, new forms of social organization. It was cultural evolution in fast forward. The transformation in agricultural techniques is particularly impressive. Before the drought, many of these societies had relied on relatively simple farming methods that worked well in good years but failed catastrophically in bad ones. After the crisis, we see much more sophisticated approaches. Diverse crops instead of monocultures, multiple small fields instead of single large ones, water conservation techniques that captured and stored every possible drop of rainfall. They also developed better food storage systems. If you visit ancient Pueblo sites, you'll find storage rooms that could keep corn viable for years. They learned to prepare for bad times during good times, to never assume that because this year had good rainfall, next year would too. They developed social systems for sharing food during crises, networks of reciprocity that could help communities survive when local crops failed. The changes weren't just practical, but philosophical. Many Native American cultures that emerged from this period have worldviews that emphasize balance, reciprocity, and sustainability. The idea that humans must live in harmony with their environment, that taking too much or growing too fast leads to disaster, seems to be a lesson learned from the medieval drought. Compare this to European cultures of the same period, which were moving toward ideas of dominance over nature, of endless growth and expansion. What about the Maya? Their transformation was perhaps even more remarkable. The great cities were abandoned, yes, but Maya culture adapted and survived. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in the 1500s, they found millions of Maya people living in smaller cities and towns, still practicing their traditional agriculture, still speaking their languages, still maintaining their calendar systems and religious practices. They had learned to be less dependent on centralized authority and monumental architecture. Instead of god-kings ruling from pyramid tops, they had councils of elders. Instead of massive public works projects, they focused on community projects that everyone could participate in. They became less hierarchical, more egalitarian, more flexible. And here's something that'll blow your mind. Some Maya groups actually thrived during and after the drought. Communities in the northern Yucatan, where there are no rivers, but where water can be accessed through cenotes, natural sinkholes that reach the water table, actually grew during this period. They had a more reliable water source than the rain-dependent agriculture of the southern cities. Places like Mayapan and later Merida became new centers of Maya civilization. The story of the medieval drought also challenges our assumptions about progress and development. We tend to think of history as a straight line, from simple to complex, from primitive to advanced. But what happened in medieval America shows that sometimes the most advanced response to a crisis is to simplify, to decentralize, to return to basics. The descendants of Cahokia and Chaco Canyon didn't see themselves as fallen from grace, but as having learned important lessons. This is particularly relevant today, isn't it? As we face our own climate crisis, there's a tendency to believe that technology will save us, that we can engineer our way out of any problem. But the medieval American experience suggests that sometimes the solution isn't to double down on complexity, but to rethink our entire approach. Sometimes the sustainable future looks more like the Hopi mesas than Cahokia's pyramids. The medieval drought also had profound effects on the biological landscape of America. As human populations declined and agricultural fields were abandoned, nature reclaimed vast areas. Forests that had been cleared for farming grew back. Animal populations that had been suppressed by hunting rebounded. By the time Europeans arrived, they found what they thought was pristine wilderness, but was actually a landscape in recovery, a post-apocalyptic regrowth from the collapse of the Mississippi Valley civilizations. This recovery of nature had its own consequences. The regrown forests changed local climate patterns, affecting rainfall and temperature. The return of large animal populations altered the ecology of entire regions. The famous buffalo herds that dominated the Great Plains in the historic period may have been partly a result of the decline of human hunting pressure after the collapse of the Mississippi Valley civilizations. Even disease patterns changed. Large, dense populations like Cahokia are breeding grounds for infectious diseases. When these populations dispersed, the disease landscape of America changed. Some diseases probably died out entirely. Others became less virulent as they adapted to smaller, more dispersed host populations. This would have enormous consequences when European diseases arrived centuries later, finding Native American populations with no immunity to Old World pathogens. The linguistic landscape was transformed too. As people migrated and mixed, languages evolved rapidly. New languages emerged from the mixing of different groups. Others went extinct as their last speakers were absorbed into other communities. The dialect chains and language families that linguists study today were shaped by the movements and mixtures of the medieval drought period. Trade networks were completely reorganized. The great continental trade systems centered on places like Cahokia and Chaco Canyon broke down, replaced by more localized networks. Valuable materials like turquoise, copper, and shells still moved across the continent, but through different routes and intermediaries. New trade centers emerged, while old ones were abandoned. The economic geography of an entire continent was redrawn. Even the spiritual landscape changed. Sacred sites were abandoned or their meaning was transformed. New pilgrimage routes developed. Religious practices evolved to reflect the new realities. Some gods were forgotten, while others gained prominence. The very relationship between humans and the divine was reconsidered in light of the crisis. The impact on art and material culture was profound. The distinctive pottery styles of Cahokia and Chaco Canyon disappeared, replaced by new traditions. Architectural styles evolved. Decorative motifs changed. Even basic technologies like how to make stone tools or process food were altered as people adapted to new environments and resources. But perhaps the most profound change was in how people thought about time and history. Before the drought, many of these societies seemed to have had a cyclical view of time, believing that the future would essentially repeat the past, that the same ceremonies performed in the same ways would produce the same results. The drought shattered this certainty. Time became linear, unpredictable, something to be carefully navigated rather than simply repeated. This shift in temporal thinking shows up in various ways. Oral traditions began to emphasize change and adaptation rather than continuity and tradition. Calendar systems were modified to better predict irregular weather patterns. Even artistic representations changed, with fewer depictions of eternal, unchanging gods and more focus on transformation and journey narratives. The medieval drought also changed how these societies thought about space. Before, many groups had seen themselves as fundamentally connected to specific places, with identity tied to particular landscapes. After the migrations, identity became more portable. You could be Puebloan wherever you lived, not just in a specific Pueblo. This was a profound psychological shift that would help Native American peoples survive the even greater disruptions that were coming with European colonization. Gender roles were transformed too. In many of the pre-drought civilizations, there seems to have been fairly rigid gender divisions in labor and social roles. The crisis forced more flexibility. Women took on roles previously reserved for men when necessary. Men learned skills traditionally associated with women. Survival required everyone to contribute however they could, regardless of traditional gender expectations. The concept of leadership changed dramatically. The god kings of Cahokia and the great chiefs of Chaco Canyon gave way to more collective forms of governance. Leaders became facilitators rather than autocrats, coordinators rather than commanders. The failure of the old hierarchies to prevent or manage the crisis led to deep skepticism about concentrated power that persists in many Native American cultures today. Even concepts of property and ownership evolved. In the great centers, there had been clear distinctions between elite and common property, between public and private spaces. In the post-drought societies, more communal forms of ownership emerged. Land, water, and other crucial resources were more likely to be managed collectively, with use rights rather than ownership being the key concept. The role of warfare changed dramatically. Before the drought, warfare seems to have been relatively ritualized, focused on capturing prisoners for sacrifice or demonstrating dominance, rather than seizing resources. During and after the crisis, warfare became more pragmatic and desperate. People fought over water sources, agricultural land, and food stores. But then, as new equilibriums were established, many societies developed strong traditions of peace and conflict resolution, having seen where unlimited warfare led. What's remarkable is how much innovation emerged from this crisis. New technologies for water management, food storage, and agriculture. New forms of social organization that were more resilient to environmental stress. New philosophical and religious frameworks for understanding humanity's relationship with nature. The medieval drought was devastating, but it was also a catalyst for remarkable human creativity and adaptation. Consider the development of new agricultural techniques alone. The Three Sisters agriculture, corn, beans, and squash, grown together, became more widespread after the drought. This wasn't just efficient farming, it was ecological genius. The corn provides a structure for the beans to climb. The beans fix nitrogen in the soil, fertilizing the corn and squash. The squash leaves shade the ground, reducing water evaporation and suppressing weeds. Together, these three crops provide complete protein and a balanced diet. This is permaculture, centuries before the term was invented. Or think about the architectural innovations. The post-drought pueblos were marvels of passive solar design. Built with thick adobe walls that absorbed heat during the day and released it at night. Oriented to maximize winter sun and minimize summer heat. With flat roofs that could be used as additional living space and for drying food. These buildings were comfortable year-round in extreme climates without any fossil fuels.
The social innovations were equally impressive. Many post-drought societies developed sophisticated systems for managing common resources, rules about when and how much water could be taken from streams, rotation systems for farming plots, collective labor systems for maintaining irrigation channels. These weren't imposed by central authorities, but developed through community consensus and maintained through social pressure. The crisis also led to innovations in food processing and preservation, techniques for making pemmican, a concentrated mixture of fat and protein that could last for years, methods for freeze-drying potatoes in the high mountains, ways to process acorns to remove their bitter tannins and turn them into nutritious flour. This knowledge would prove crucial, not just for surviving droughts, but for enabling long-distance travel and trade. Even recreational activities evolved. Many of the games and sports that became characteristic of Native American cultures seem to have developed or spread during this period. These weren't just entertainment, but served important social functions, building community cohesion, providing outlets for competition that didn't lead to actual conflict, maintaining physical fitness, and even serving religious purposes. The development of new medicines and healing practices accelerated during this time. The stress of the crisis, the movements of populations, and the exposure to new environments led to both new health challenges and new discoveries. Knowledge of herbal medicine was shared across cultural boundaries. Healing practices were adapted and combined. The sophisticated understanding of herbal medicine that Native American peoples would later share with European colonists was partly a product of this period of crisis and adaptation. The storytelling traditions that emerged from this period are incredibly rich. Every group that survived the medieval drought had stories to tell about the journey, the struggle, the transformation. These weren't just entertainment, but crucial cultural knowledge, encoding information about where to find water, how to recognize good agricultural land, which plants were safe to eat, how to prepare for droughts, and how to maintain social cohesion during crises. These stories also served psychological functions, helping people process the trauma of leaving their homes, losing loved ones, and watching their world change. They provided meaning to suffering, hope for the future, and connection to both ancestors and descendants. The oral traditions became libraries of practical knowledge, philosophical wisdom, and emotional support. The artistic expressions that emerged from this period are haunting and beautiful. Pottery decorated with migration symbols, spirals representing journey, broken lines representing disruption and renewal, rock art depicting the movement of peoples across landscapes, textiles with patterns that told stories of drought and survival. These weren't just decorative, but were ways of maintaining cultural memory and identity. Music evolved too. New instruments were developed or adapted. Song cycles were created that told the story of the migrations. Ceremonial music evolved to reflect new spiritual understandings. The haunting flute music of the Southwest, the complex drumming patterns of the eastern woodlands, the polyphonic singing styles of various groups. Much of this musical heritage has roots in the transformations of the medieval drought period. The mathematical and astronomical knowledge of these societies was refined during this period. Better understanding of weather patterns, more accurate calendars, more sophisticated ways of predicting seasonal changes. The Pueblo peoples developed sun calendars so precise they could predict the exact day to plant crops for optimal growth. This wasn't abstract science, but practical knowledge crucial for survival. Navigation techniques were developed or refined as people moved across unfamiliar landscapes. Ways of reading the stars, understanding the flight patterns of birds, recognizing subtle changes in vegetation that indicated water sources. This knowledge was encoded in stories, songs, and ceremonial practices, ensuring it would be passed down through generations. The concept of resilience became central to many of these cultures. Not resilience as just bouncing back to how things were, but resilience as the ability to transform, to adapt, to become something new while maintaining core values and identity. This is a sophisticated understanding of resilience that modern psychology and ecology are only now catching up to. If you enjoy these history videos, please like the video and subscribe to History Candle YouTube channel. Your engagement helps us bring more of these untold stories to light. The medieval drought also left physical scars on the landscape that can still be seen today. Flying over the Southwest, you can see the outlines of ancient irrigation canals, abandoned fields, and old roadways. In the Mississippi Valley, the Great Mounds of Cahokia stand as monuments to a lost civilization. These archaeological sites aren't just historical curiosities, but sacred places for many Native American peoples, physical connections to their ancestors and their stories.
The lessons from this period have profound relevance for our world today. We're facing our own climate crisis, our own questions about sustainability and resilience. The medieval American experience shows us that civilizations can and do collapse when they push beyond environmental limits, but also that collapse doesn't have to mean the end. It can be transformation, adaptation, the beginning of something new and perhaps better suited to reality. Think about the parallels. Our modern cities, like Cahokia, depend on complex systems to sustain populations far beyond what the local environment could naturally support. Our global trade networks, like those centered on Chaco Canyon, are vulnerable to disruption. Our industrial agriculture, like the intensive farming of the Maya, is pushing against environmental limits. Are we heading for our own version of the medieval drought? But the story also offers hope. Human beings are incredibly adaptable. We can change, we can learn, we can build new ways of living when the old ways no longer work. The descendants of Cahokia and Chaco didn't disappear, they transformed. They learned from the crisis and built societies that were more sustainable, more resilient, more in harmony with their environment. The indigenous knowledge systems that developed from this crisis are now being recognized for their value. Traditional ecological knowledge, sustainable agricultural practices, water management techniques developed over centuries. These are being studied and applied to modern challenges. The Hopi dry farming techniques are being examined as models for agriculture in increasingly arid regions. The social systems for managing common resources are being studied by economists and political scientists. The philosophical insights are perhaps even more valuable. The understanding that human societies are part of nature, not separate from it. The recognition that growth has limits, that bigger isn't always better, that simplicity can be a form of sophistication. These aren't primitive ideas, but sophisticated responses to complex challenges. The medieval drought also reminds us that climate change isn't just about temperature and rainfall. It's about everything: social systems, economic networks, political structures, cultural values, spiritual beliefs. When the climate changes, everything changes. The societies that survive and thrive are the ones that recognize this and adapt holistically, not just technologically, but culturally. One of the most important lessons is about the danger of rigidity. The societies that collapsed most completely were often the ones that were most committed to maintaining their existing systems. They kept building monuments as people starved. They maintained elaborate ceremonies even as the rains failed to come. They insisted on hierarchies even as those hierarchies failed to provide solutions. The societies that survived were the ones that were willing to change, to abandon old ways when they no longer worked, to experiment with new approaches. This flexibility extended to identity itself. Groups that insisted on maintaining rigid ethnic or cultural boundaries often failed, while those that were willing to incorporate outsiders, to learn from other traditions, to blend and adapt, were more likely to survive. The medieval drought was a great mixer, breaking down old boundaries and creating new hybrid cultures that were stronger for their diversity. The role of leadership during crisis is another crucial lesson. The old-style leaders who claimed divine authority and demanded obedience failed when their promises of prosperity and protection proved hollow. The leaders who succeeded were those who admitted uncertainty, who involved their communities in decision-making, who were willing to change course when things weren't working. Leadership became less about commanding and more about facilitating collective adaptation. The importance of local knowledge and adaptation is another key insight. There was no single response to the drought that worked everywhere. What worked in the Rio Grande Valley didn't work in the eastern woodlands. What worked for one community might fail for another just a few miles away. The societies that survived were those that paid attention to their specific circumstances, that developed local solutions rather than trying to impose universal ones. The medieval drought also highlights the importance of maintaining diversity, agricultural diversity, economic diversity, social diversity. The societies that had put all their eggs in one basket, whether that was a single crop, a single trade good, or a single form of organization, were the most vulnerable. Those that maintained multiple options, multiple strategies, multiple ways of doing things had better chances of finding something that worked when conditions changed. The speed of change is another important factor. The drought didn't happen overnight, it developed over decades. This gave some societies time to adapt gradually, to experiment with different responses, to learn from their mistakes. But it also meant that the crisis could sneak up on people, that they could fail to recognize how serious it was until it was too late. The proverbial frog in slowly boiling water.
This gradual onset also meant that different generations experienced the crisis differently. For the generation that remembered the good times, the drought was a catastrophe, a fall from grace. For the generation born during the drought, it was simply reality, the only world they'd ever known. For the generation that came after, it was history, a story their grandparents told. Each generation had to find its own way of understanding and responding to the crisis. The psychological and emotional dimensions of the crisis are often overlooked, but were probably crucial. The stress, the grief, the fear, the uncertainty, these would have been overwhelming. Some people probably gave up hope entirely. Others found strength in community, in faith, in the struggle itself. The cultures that developed strong systems for emotional and psychological support were more likely to maintain social cohesion during the crisis. The role of spirituality and religion in helping people cope with and understand the crisis was profound. Some groups interpreted the drought as divine punishment and responded with increased devotion and sacrifice. Others saw it as a test, a challenge to overcome. Still others understood it as part of natural cycles, something to be endured and adapted to, rather than fought against. These different spiritual frameworks led to very different practical responses. The importance of maintaining hope while acknowledging reality stands out in the stories from this period. The societies that survived weren't necessarily the most optimistic. Blind optimism could lead to failure to prepare. But neither were they the most pessimistic. Despair could become self-fulfilling prophecy. The successful societies seemed to find a middle path, hoping for the best while preparing for the worst. The crisis also revealed the importance of children and education. Societies that continued to invest in their children, teaching them both traditional knowledge and new skills needed for the changing world, were more likely to survive long-term. The knowledge and skills that children learned during the crisis became the foundation for the new societies that emerged afterward. The role of women during the crisis appears to have been crucial, though often overlooked in traditional histories. In many societies, women were the keepers of agricultural knowledge, the managers of water resources, the maintainers of social networks that became crucial for survival. The crisis seems to have led to increased recognition of women's contributions and, in some cases, more egalitarian gender relations. The elderly also played a crucial role. Their knowledge of past droughts, of alternative food sources, of old migration routes became invaluable. Societies that maintained respect for elders and their knowledge had access to crucial information for survival.
The crisis reinforced the importance of intergenerational knowledge transfer. The medieval drought transformed the meaning of wealth itself. Before the crisis, wealth might have meant precious objects, elaborate costumes, control over labor. During and after the crisis, wealth increasingly meant practical things: stored food, access to water, strong social networks, useful skills. The conspicuous consumption that had characterized some of the pre-drought societies gave way to more practical values. The concept of success was similarly transformed. Success no longer meant building the biggest pyramid or conducting the most elaborate ceremony. Success meant getting your family through another year, maintaining peaceful relations with neighbors, adapting successfully to new conditions. These might seem like lower aspirations, but they were actually more challenging and more important. The relationship between humans and animals changed too. As agriculture became more difficult, many groups became more dependent on hunting and gathering. This required detailed knowledge of animal behavior, seasonal patterns, and ecosystem dynamics. Some groups developed closer relationships with certain animals. Turkeys were increasingly domesticated. Dogs became even more important as hunting companions and pack animals. The understanding of time itself was transformed. Before the crisis, many societies seemed to have thought in terms of eternal cycles, endless repetition of the same patterns. The drought broke this cyclical thinking. Time became more linear, more unpredictable. The future was no longer assumed to resemble the past. This was both terrifying and liberating, closing off old possibilities while opening new ones. The concept of home changed. For societies that had been settled in one place for centuries, home was a specific location, a particular landscape. After the migrations, home became more portable, more flexible. Home was where your people were, where you could practice your traditions, where you could make a living. This more flexible concept of home would serve Native American peoples well in the centuries to come. Even the understanding of what it meant to be human evolved. The crisis revealed both the worst and best of human nature, the violence and selfishness that emerged when resources were scarce, but also the cooperation and sacrifice that helped communities survive. Many of the stories from this period explore what it means to remain human, to maintain values and identity under extreme stress. The medieval drought also changed how these societies understood their place in the larger world. Before, many had seen themselves as the center of the universe, the chosen people of the gods. The crisis forced a recognition that they were subject to forces beyond their control, part of larger patterns and cycles. This was humbling, but also connecting, creating a sense of shared fate with other peoples, and even with non-human nature. The practical innovations that emerged from this period continue to astound researchers. Techniques for detecting underground water sources, methods for predicting weather patterns based on subtle environmental signs, ways of constructing buildings that could withstand both droughts and floods, systems for organizing collective labor without central authority. These weren't primitive solutions, but sophisticated technologies adapted to specific conditions. The social technologies were equally impressive, ways of making collective decisions that balanced different interests, systems for sharing resources that encouraged conservation without requiring coercion, methods for resolving conflicts without violence, practices for maintaining cultural identity while adapting to new circumstances. These social innovations were just as important for survival as any physical technology. The intellectual achievements of this period are often underappreciated. The careful observation of natural patterns that allowed prediction of weather and climate. The mathematical knowledge needed to design irrigation systems and architectural structures. The botanical knowledge required to identify and cultivate useful plants in new environments. The geographical knowledge that enabled successful migrations across vast distances. These societies were filled with scientists, even if they wouldn't have used that term. The artistic and aesthetic responses to the crisis revealed deep cultural resilience. Beautiful pottery continued to be made even during the worst of the drought. Music and dance remained central to community life. Stories were told and retold, evolving with each telling. The human need for beauty, for meaning, for creative expression, persisted even in the face of existential crisis. The linguistic innovations of this period were remarkable. New words were created to describe new experiences. Old words took on new meanings. Languages borrowed from each other as groups mixed. Entire new languages emerged from the mixing of different groups. Language evolved rapidly to meet the needs of rapidly changing societies. The changes in child-rearing practices during this period had long-lasting effects. Children had to be prepared for a more uncertain world. They needed to learn flexibility, adaptability, resilience. Traditional knowledge remained important, but it had to be balanced with openness to new ideas. The generation that grew up during the crisis became the bridge between the old world and the new. The transformation of trade and exchange systems created new forms of economic life. Instead of long-distance trade in luxury goods, there was more emphasis on local exchange of necessities. Instead of centralized redistribution, there were more peer-to-peer networks. Instead of accumulation of wealth, there was more emphasis on reciprocity and sharing. These new economic systems were more resilient to disruption. The changes in food systems were revolutionary. New crops were adopted, new processing techniques developed, new preservation methods invented. Diets became more diverse, incorporating a wider range of plants and animals. Food security became a central organizing principle of society. The relationship between people and their food became more intimate, more knowledgeable, more respectful. The medieval drought even changed how these societies understood and practiced medicine. New diseases emerged from the stress and displacement. Old remedies no longer worked in new environments. Medical knowledge had to be shared across cultural boundaries to deal with new challenges. The understanding of the connection between environment, diet, lifestyle, and health deepened. The crisis led to innovations in communication and information sharing, systems for rapidly transmitting information about weather, resources, and threats, networks for sharing knowledge across vast distances, methods for preserving and transmitting crucial information across generations. These communication systems were essential for coordinating responses to the crisis. The understanding of causation and correlation became more sophisticated. People learned to distinguish between coincidence and causation, between local and regional patterns, between short-term fluctuations and long-term trends. This more sophisticated understanding was crucial for developing effective responses to the crisis. The concept of community was transformed. Before the drought, community might have been defined by kinship, by residence, by participation in certain ceremonies. After the crisis, community became more flexible, more inclusive, more based on shared experience and mutual aid. The bonds forged during the crisis created new forms of social solidarity. Even concepts of beauty changed. The aesthetic of excess that had characterized some pre-drought societies gave way to an aesthetic of efficiency, of harmony, of sustainability. Beautiful objects were those that were well-made and useful, not just decorative. Beautiful landscapes were those that could sustain life, not just please the eye.
The understanding of sacred and profane was transformed. Previously, ordinary activities like finding water or successful farming became sacred acts. Previously sacred places were abandoned as profane when they could no longer sustain life. The sacred became more portable, more flexible, more integrated into daily life rather than separated from it. The role of humor and entertainment during the crisis shouldn't be underestimated. Jokes, games, and stories provided psychological relief from stress. They maintained morale when conditions were dire. They created bonds between people who might otherwise have been divided. The societies that maintained their ability to laugh, to play, to find joy even in difficult circumstances were more likely to maintain the social cohesion necessary for survival. The crisis also accelerated technological diffusion. Innovations that might have taken centuries to spread in normal times were rapidly adopted when they offered survival advantages. A new technique for storing water, a better way to process food, a more efficient hunting tool. These spread across cultural boundaries with unprecedented speed. The understanding of risk and uncertainty became more sophisticated. People learned to prepare for multiple possible futures rather than assuming the future would resemble the past. They developed portfolios of strategies rather than relying on single solutions. They learned to recognize early warning signs of crisis and respond before it was too late. The concept of justice evolved during the crisis. Traditional ideas about fairness and reciprocity had to be balanced with the harsh realities of scarcity. New systems for allocating scarce resources had to be developed. The tension between individual survival and collective good had to be navigated. These ethical challenges led to sophisticated moral philosophies that continue to influence Native American thought today. The crisis even changed how these societies understood knowledge itself. Previously, knowledge might have been seen as fixed, eternal, passed down unchanged from the ancestors. The crisis forced a recognition that knowledge had to evolve, that new conditions required new understanding. This more dynamic view of knowledge was crucial for successful adaptation. The relationship between tradition and innovation was recalibrated. Pure traditionalism was a recipe for extinction when traditional ways no longer worked, but complete abandonment of tradition meant losing crucial knowledge and identity. The successful societies found ways to maintain core traditions while being radically innovative in other areas. The understanding of human agency versus environmental determinism became more nuanced. The drought showed that humans were subject to environmental forces beyond their control, but the varied responses to the drought showed that humans weren't simply passive victims of environmental change. The interaction between human choice and environmental constraint became a central theme in the stories and philosophies that emerged from this period. The concept of progress was fundamentally questioned. The pre-drought societies had often seen themselves as progressing, becoming more complex, more powerful, more sophisticated. The drought showed that this progress could be reversed, that complexity could become vulnerability. A more cyclical or spiral view of history emerged, recognizing both progress and regress as possibilities. The crisis led to a deeper understanding of interconnection. The failure of rain in one region affected trade networks hundreds of miles away. The migration of one group displaced others. The adoption of new agricultural techniques and changed entire ecosystems. Everything was connected to everything else, and changes in one area rippled out to affect the whole system. The medieval drought also transformed warfare and conflict. Resource scarcity led to increased competition and violence, but the experience of violence also led to innovation in conflict resolution and peacekeeping. Many societies developed elaborate systems for avoiding or minimizing conflict, recognizing that warfare during times of scarcity could lead to mutual destruction. The understanding of carrying capacity became central to post-drought societies. They learned, often through bitter experience, that environments could only support so many people, that growth had limits, that exceeding carrying capacity led to collapse. This understanding was built into social systems, agricultural practices, and even religious beliefs. The concept of sustainability, though they wouldn't have used that word, became central. Practices were evaluated not just for their immediate benefit, but for their long-term viability. Could this agricultural technique be maintained indefinitely? Would this hunting practice deplete game populations? These questions became central to decision-making. The crisis also led to innovations in governance. The failures of centralized authority during the drought led to experiments with more distributed forms of power. Consensus building, rotation of leadership, checks on authority, incorporation of diverse voices. These democratic innovations emerged from the crisis of the medieval drought. The understanding of human nature itself was affected by this crisis. The crisis revealed human capacity for both cooperation and competition, for both altruism and selfishness, for both innovation and stubbornness. This complex view of human nature was reflected in the stories, philosophies, and social systems that emerged from this period. Looking at all of this, it's amazing to think about how completely the medieval drought transformed the Americas. Entire civilizations rose and fell. Millions of people moved across vast distances. Technologies, languages, and cultures mixed and evolved. The very landscape was transformed. And all of this happened just a few centuries before European contact would bring even more dramatic changes. What's perhaps most remarkable is how this story was preserved. Without writing systems in most of North America, without monuments inscribed with historical records, the story of the medieval drought was kept alive through oral tradition, through cultural practice, through the very structure of the societies that emerged from it. Every pueblo on its mesa top, every story of migration and emergence, every ceremony for bringing rain carries within it the memory of the medieval drought. Modern archaeology and climate science have allowed us to piece together this story in unprecedented detail. Tree rings, lake sediments, pollen records, isotope analysis, these scientific techniques have confirmed and elaborated on what Native American oral traditions have maintained for centuries. The convergence of indigenous knowledge and Western science has revealed a history of crisis and transformation that rivals anything in the Old World. The lessons of the medieval drought feel incredibly relevant today. We too face climate change, resource depletion, and the need for fundamental transformation of our societies. We too must balance tradition with innovation, local adaptation with global connection, individual survival with collective good. The ancestors of today's Native Americans faced these challenges and found ways through them.
Their descendants carry that knowledge, that resilience, that adaptability. The story also challenges us to think about what we mean by collapse and continuity. The great cities were abandoned, but the people survived. The monumental architecture crumbled, but the cultures evolved. The political systems failed, but new forms of organization emerged. Was this collapse or transformation? Ending or beginning? Perhaps it was both, or perhaps those categories are too simple for such a complex process. As we face our own uncertain future, the medieval drought reminds us that change, even catastrophic change, doesn't have to mean the end. It can be an opportunity for transformation, for innovation, for the emergence of new ways of living that are better adapted to reality. The crisis was terrible, causing immense suffering and loss. But from that crisis emerged societies that were, in many ways, more sustainable, more resilient, more humane. The indigenous peoples of the Americas carry within their cultures the memory and wisdom of the medieval drought. Their ancestors' survival through that crisis, their innovation and adaptation, their transformation and resilience are encoded in languages, stories, practices, and philosophies that continue to evolve today. This is not dead history, but living knowledge, relevant not just to understanding the past, but to navigating the present and future. The medieval drought that changed America is a story of loss, but also of survival, of collapse, but also of transformation, of ending, but also of a beginning. It's a reminder that human beings are capable of extraordinary adaptation, that cultures can evolve rapidly when necessary, that what seems like the end of the world might actually be the beginning of a new one. As we've seen throughout this story, the responses to the medieval drought were as varied as the societies that faced it. Some doubled down on traditional practices and perished. Others abandoned everything and lost their identity. But the most successful found a middle way, maintaining core values and knowledge while radically transforming their practical lives. They learned that survival required not just technological innovation, but social, cultural, and spiritual evolution. The story of the medieval drought is also a reminder of the importance of diversity. Monocultures, whether agricultural or cultural, are vulnerable to disruption. The societies that maintained or developed diversity in crops, in social organization, in problem-solving approaches were more likely to find something that worked when conditions changed. This lesson feels particularly relevant in our increasingly interconnected but also homogenized world. The crisis also highlights the importance of local knowledge and adaptation. There was no single solution that worked everywhere. What saved one community might doom another. The successful responses were those that paid careful attention to local conditions, that developed place-based solutions rather than trying to impose universal ones. In our age of global solutions and standardization, this emphasis on local adaptation feels both challenging and necessary. The medieval drought transformed not just human societies, but entire ecosystems. The abandonment of agricultural fields, the regrowth of forests, the recovery of animal populations. These ecological changes were as dramatic as the human ones. The landscape that European colonizers encountered wasn't pristine wilderness, but a post-crisis ecosystem, still recovering and adapting centuries later. This ecological transformation reminds us that human and natural history can't be separated. The drought shaped human societies, but human responses to the drought shaped ecosystems. The feedback loops between human action and environmental change were complex and sometimes unexpected.
Understanding these interactions is crucial for managing our own environmental challenges. The story of the medieval drought also reveals the importance of timescales in understanding historical change. The drought developed over decades, too slowly for any individual to fully perceive, but too quickly for societies to easily adapt. The migrations took generations, with children born on the journey who never saw either the origin nor destination. The recovery and transformation continued for centuries. These long timescales challenge our tendency to think in terms of years or even individual lifetimes. Looking back at this history, we might wonder what would have happened without the medieval drought. Would Cahokia have grown into an even greater city? Would the ancestral Pueblans have developed even more complex societies? Would the Maya have experienced a renaissance rather than transformation? We can't know, of course. But perhaps the crisis, terrible as it was, led to more sustainable, more resilient, more humane societies than would have developed otherwise. The medieval drought wasn't just a North American phenomenon. Climate records show that this was part of global climate patterns, with droughts, floods, and temperature changes affecting societies worldwide. The Viking colonies in Greenland were failing at the same time Cahokia was declining. Angkor Wat in Cambodia was facing its own water crisis. The Mongol expansion was partly driven by climate changes in Central Asia. The medieval drought that changed America was part of a global climate crisis that reshaped human civilization across the planet. This global perspective reminds us that climate change has always been a driver of human history. The stable climate of the past 10,000 years, the Holocene, allowed the development of agriculture and complex societies. But even within that relatively stable period, climate fluctuations have triggered migrations, conflicts, innovations, and transformations. We are climate creatures, whether we recognize it or not. As we near the end of this story, I want to bring it back to the human level. Behind all the grand historical patterns and societal transformations were individual people. Mothers trying to feed their children, farmers watching their fields turn to dust, leaders trying to hold communities together, young people deciding whether to stay or leave, elders passing on what knowledge they could to a generation facing challenges they'd never imagined. These people were just like us in their fundamental humanity. They loved their families, feared for their futures, hoped for better times. They made difficult decisions with incomplete information. They balanced self-interest with community good. They struggled with change while trying to maintain identity. Their specific circumstances were different from ours, but their human challenges were remarkably similar. The medieval drought that changed America is both a cautionary tale and an inspiring one. It warns us about the vulnerability of even the most impressive civilizations to environmental change. It shows us that business as usual can become impossible when conditions shift. It reminds us that the future might not resemble the past, but it also shows us human resilience and adaptability. It demonstrates that survival is possible even in the face of catastrophic change. It reveals the importance of community, flexibility, and innovation. It proves that endings can also be beginnings, that crisis can catalyze transformation, that humans can learn and adapt and emerge stronger from even the most challenging experiences. As we face our own climate crisis, our own need for transformation, we would do well to remember the lessons of the medieval drought. The ancestors of today's Native Americans faced catastrophic climate change and found ways not just to survive, but to create new forms of life adapted to new realities. Their descendants carry that knowledge and resilience forward. The story of the medieval drought reminds us that we are not the first to face such challenges, and we won't be the last. Human beings have been adapting to changing climates throughout our history. We have migrated, innovated, transformed. We have found ways to survive and even thrive in the most challenging conditions. This history doesn't guarantee our future success, but it does show that success is possible. The medieval drought that changed America was one of the great transformative events in human history, comparable to the fall of Rome or the Bronze Age collapse. Yet it remains largely unknown outside of specialist circles. These civilizations left no written records of their struggles, no chronicles of their transformations, but they left something perhaps more valuable: successful examples of adaptation, transformation, and resilience in the face of catastrophic change. As our own world faces rising temperatures, changing precipitation patterns, and increasing climate instability, the story of the medieval drought becomes not just historically interesting, but practically relevant. How do societies adapt to climate change? What works and what doesn't? How do you maintain social cohesion during crisis? How do you balance tradition with innovation? These aren't just academic questions anymore, they're challenges we all face. The indigenous peoples of the Americas have much to teach us about these questions. Their ancestors lived through catastrophic climate change and emerged with sustainable ways of life. Their traditional ecological knowledge, developed and refined over centuries, offers insights into living within environmental limits. Their social systems, evolved through crisis, provide models for resilience and adaptation. But perhaps the most important lesson of the medieval drought is about the nature of change itself. Change isn't just about technology or infrastructure. It's about worldview, values, relationships, identity. The societies that successfully navigated the medieval drought were those that were willing to transform not just their practical lives, but their fundamental assumptions about the world and their place in it. This deep transformation is perhaps what we most need to learn from the medieval drought. We too may need to reimagine our relationship with nature, our definitions of progress and success, our systems of governance and economics. Like the inhabitants of Cahokia and Chaco Canyon, we may need to leave behind ways of life that no longer work and create new ones adapted to new realities. The story of the medieval drought that changed America is ultimately a story about us, about human beings facing existential challenges and finding ways through them. It's about the end of worlds and the beginning of new ones. It's about loss and survival, collapse and transformation, tradition and innovation. It's about the incredible adaptability of human cultures and the resilience of the human spirit. As we face our own uncertain future, we can draw inspiration from those who faced similar challenges centuries ago. They didn't have our technology or scientific knowledge, but they had wisdom, creativity, and determination. They found ways to survive and even thrive in a transformed world. Their descendants carry that legacy forward, a testament to human adaptability and resilience. The medieval drought that changed America changed more than just the civilizations that experienced it directly. It changed the trajectory of human history in the Americas. It created the cultural landscape that Europeans would encounter. It developed knowledge and practices that continue to be relevant today. It demonstrated both the vulnerability and resilience of human societies in the face of environmental change. This story deserves to be better known, not just as history, but as wisdom for our present and future. The medieval drought reminds us that climate change is not new, that civilizations have faced and survived such challenges before, that transformation is possible even in the face of catastrophic change. It also warns us about the cost of rigidity. the danger of exceeding environmental limits, the importance of adaptation and innovation. As we conclude this journey through one of history's great transformations, I hope you've gained a new appreciation for the complexity and sophistication of pre-Columbian American civilizations. These weren't primitive peoples overwhelmed by forces beyond their comprehension. They were complex societies facing difficult challenges with intelligence, creativity, and determination. I also hope you've thought about the relevance of this history to our own time. The specific circumstances are different, but the fundamental challenges are remarkably similar. How do we adapt to a changing climate? How do we transform our societies to be more sustainable? How do we maintain what's valuable from our traditions while innovating for new conditions? These questions, faced by the inhabitants of medieval America, are our questions too. The medieval drought that changed America is a story without a simple ending. The transformations it triggered continued for centuries and, in some ways, continue today. The descendants of those who lived through the drought carry that lesson in their cultures, their stories, their ways of life. The landscapes bear its marks. The archaeological sites preserve its memory. This is not a dead history, but a living one, relevant not just for understanding the past, but for navigating the present and future. The wisdom gained from the medieval drought about sustainability, resilience, adaptation, transformation is wisdom we desperately need today. The examples of successful adaptation provide models and inspiration. The warnings about rigidity and excess remain relevant. As we face our own climate crisis, we would do well to remember that we are not the first to face such challenges. Others have walked this path before us. They found ways through crisis to create new forms of life adapted to new realities. Their journey was difficult, often tragic, but ultimately successful. They survived, they adapted, they transformed. And in doing so, they left us not just a historical record, but a guide for our own transformation. The medieval drought that changed America changed what it means to be human in a changing world. It revealed our vulnerability, but also our adaptability. It showed our capacity for both failure and innovation. It demonstrated that even the most catastrophic changes don't have to mean the end. They can be opportunities for transformation and renewal. This is perhaps the ultimate lesson of the medieval drought, that human beings are capable of extraordinary adaptation, that cultures can transform while maintaining their essence, that what seems like the end might actually be a beginning. As we face our own uncertain future, this history offers both warning and hope, both cautionary tale and inspiration. The story of the medieval drought that changed America changed far more than just one continent. It demonstrated the incredible capacity of human beings to adapt and survive even the most challenging circumstances. As we face our challenges, may we draw wisdom and inspiration from those who came before, who faced the unthinkable and found ways not just to survive, but to create new worlds from the ashes of the old. If you enjoy these history videos, please like the video and subscribe to History Candle YouTube channel. Your support helps us continue exploring these fascinating and important stories from our shared human past. Until next time, remember that history isn't just about the past, it's about understanding our present and preparing for our future. The lessons of the medieval drought are more relevant today than ever before, reminding us that even in the face of catastrophic change, human creativity, resilience, and adaptability can find ways forward.